Welcome to Born to be Barefoot. I'm your host, Stuart Gordon, with my co-host, Katie Tsuyuki. Welcome to our latest podcast in the Born to be Barefoot series. And today we've got a lovely special guest that I and my co-host, Katie Tsuyuki, will be happy to introduce. Joe Vecchione. He's a Canadian soccer coach and is in diverse strength and conditioning applications, from soccer all the way to swimming, which I'm going to be interested to hear how those two work together, Joe. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And how's anything special coming up? I'm going to go straight in there. Is there anything special coming up on your horizon in your career at the moment?
Well, for starters, I just finished my master's degree, so that was a big career milestone for me. That's one of the last times I saw you, Katie, was when I was moving out to Vancouver to do that. So I'm happy to be done that. And I'm going to the Women's World Cup with our Canadian women's national team at the end of June. We're going to be in Australia and New Zealand, and really excited to support them. They're obviously been quite successful the last decade, so hopefully we can continue to build on that success.
Yeah. So they, US and England now in ladies soccer, really pushing towards the top as well. I mean, we've been lurking there or thereabouts, and you pesky Canadians and Americans that keep batting us down. So I'm hoping this year we can go one step further. But it's been quite a success story, hasn't it, the Canadian ladies soccer?
Yeah, and even for the men's as well. Like, they qualified for the World Cup for the first time in almost over 30 years. So it's an exciting time for soccer in Canada. And I think women's soccer across the world, just the sport is growing in popularity. And the US and England are top sides. We're going to be playing England in our pre-camp. We play the US a couple times a year, just the way it shakes out with our qualifying and things like that. But yeah, it's exciting, and there's a lot of discussion actually around, injuries in the women's game, like the risk of like the incidence of ACL injuries and other injuries are quite high, and of course the foot, ankle, and hip all come into play there, the core. So yeah, hopefully there's more research in that side of it as to how all those things interact for women and how we can reduce those injury risks. We just had one of our athletes go down recently as well with an ACL, so it's tough. Especially for me, I've had 3 ACL injuries, so I have a soft spot for all of that.
Yeah, I mean, the English team have lost 2 of their top players to ACL injuries. There's a Brazilian girl, I think, as well, who's playing over here in the Women's Soccer Super League here as well. It just seems to be really prevalent. I mean, have you got a theory on this? I mean, I know there's lots of different ideas about the Q angle, the relative angle of the hips to the knees, and movement patterns, and the different style of maybe the stud pattern that we should have for women as opposed to men. Have you sort of looked into this one yourself?
I haven't looked into it myself, but I think the thing with ACL injuries, they're very multifactorial. Like, there's a lot of things that go into it, so it is hard to pinpoint a cause. And I think the research that is available would suggest exactly that. So while it's great to keep pushing forward on that specifically for the women, it is one of those really tricky things. I think there's discussions around whether different cleats would help. I don't have a comment on that, but I think that one of the main things that some of the female players would say is that, and I know like one of our athlete, Janine Becky, was just interviewed, and this was put on like TSN, which is like the main sports network here in Canada, and she was just saying that the women are being asked to play a lot more games because of the growth of the game, which is good for them. However, they don't seem to have the same level of resources as those men's teams, with support staff like myself and just things like that. So I do feel that some investment on that side of it and their training, and just like how many games should they be playing and what's a safe number, because playing 50 games a year is a lot for any top athlete, and it's just been increasing over and over. And even in the international women's game, like, we have far more games than the men's side, so these international windows are a big piece of the puzzle, I suppose. But none of the women, including myself, would want to see them playing less games. It obviously hurts their ability to market themselves, but there needs to be some consideration for how often they're playing and the level of support they're getting. Like it's a gap currently.
Yeah, right. Because it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg situation, like, is it them playing all of the games so that they can get the exposure to get the support, or does someone need to step up to be like, no, we need to get the support so that we can support them playing all these games, right?
Yeah, and whenever you have multiple matches in a week, like soccer, football is a very different sport than other sports like basketball and hockey, which are big in North America. But the mechanical stress on your body is quite high. So to play multiple matches in a week is already difficult, and like even like up to 3, it's an incredible ask when there's not the depth in the rosters that you would have in the men's game, right? So a lot of these women are playing a lot of minutes. They don't get the same rotations because the depth isn't there. So yeah, it's not just the amount of games, it's the density of them, really. When we go away, we play a lot of games in a short span too, right? So the scheduling piece is important, and it's an important factor. But like I said, it's hard to push the growth of the game without having the games itself. So not less games, but maybe the density of the schedule. I'm not sure.
Yeah, right. And what, like, when you talk about the rosters, like what is the managed difference between the men's and the women's? Like, how many more spare players do men's teams get?
Well, I mean, they would have the same amount of players, but the drop off is considerable, right? Like in these women's leagues, like, first of all, there's not the same amount of women's leagues as there are men's leagues. For example, in Canada, like, we don't even have a professional women's league. It's coming. But, for example, most of these top professional leagues will have like multiple, like, tiers within them, whereas the women's league doesn't have the same amount. And if they do, as I'm saying, like the quality of those players who are maybe in that second or third tier, there's just a big drop off from the top players. So if you're trying to win a game, you almost can't rely necessarily, for example, like, there's just a drop off, right? The depth, the talent coming on. It's coming, and there are, like, there's way more young women who are playing than ever. But I mean, I'm speaking to this a little bit from a grassroots lens, because speak to coaches who are in the community coaching these young women. I spoke to someone recently, and he was just saying how difficult it is to get 16 players on his roster for like a U16 team, right? Whereas on the boys' side, that's not an issue. So he's losing girls not only to injury, but they're also just not wanting to continue playing sport at that age. It's 16, 17 years old. So it's not just really at a higher level where the issue kind of is prevalent. It is a little bit at those younger ages, right? There's so many girls dropping out of sport at that age, and sometimes due to these injuries. Like, I went through that myself. And so yeah, we got to keep more girls in the game. We got to support them to want to keep playing football or other sports, because right now, like in the past, really, they had nothing to work towards in a way. In other sports leagues or other sports, there isn't a professional pathway, which, if you're a 16-year-old girl and you don't see a future beyond maybe university soccer, if you're not good enough to go there, you're going to stop playing. But it hurts all the other ones who are going down that path. So yeah, I mean, getting a bit tangential, but it is hopefully something that's going to be changing. And we see that. We see more girls wanting to play, and there's a big push to do those things. Like I said, there's a women's professional league in Canada. The English women's league has grown quite a lot. The NWSL is growing, and yeah, it's all positive. But we're just kind of facing some of these challenges, and it's getting more coverage and more prevalent, but I think it's always been there.
Oh yeah, it's always been there. I think keeping, the women in sport through their teenage years has been a challenge for everyone. Have you guys ever talked with your colleagues about how, like, any ideas on how to keep these, girls playing sport, aside from keeping them healthy and injury free, but you think that it's just more coverage, or?
I do think like a lot of people will say, and I think the girls on the team would say, like, having a pathway is super important, showing them that there's a path. And I think that in Canada, we're such a large country and so spread out, it is hard to get noticed, and especially when there's no professional stream, right? And it's not just the women's game. The men's game has been like this up until a few years ago, right? Like, we've only had 3 professional soccer teams in this country through the MLS, which is largely US based. But now, because the World Cup is coming to Canada in 2026, they created a professional league with 8 teams. And now, like, I see it with like the club I worked for. I worked for one of these clubs, the Vancouver Whitecaps. I worked with the academy players, and a lot of them would just kind of fizzle out, or like they would go to university and they'd want to play professionally, but they weren't maybe at the same level. But now a lot of them are playing in this league and getting these opportunities to continue developing. And I would say it's the same thing for the girls, right? Like, showing that there's a path for them and that there's going to be opportunities for them is a big part of it, you know, because I think that is one of the main things with like high level sport. And you can speak to this, Katie, but when you see that there's something there to aspire to, it kind of motivates young people to push themselves to those levels or those ideals, whether or not they can get there or not, you know. And I just thinking of the Olympics, right? Like, just the pursuit of going to the Olympics is enough to keep some athletes training for another 4 years, whether they make it, right? So I think it's the same thing in these professional sports, where if there's a league to get to, then it'll keep these young players wanting to train for that. Where before, just like, it was not even an idea. And coming from Canada, the other challenge is, like, you're taking up an international spot when you go to England. So if you're not way better than the English girls there, you're not going to get in. And it's the same thing in the US. If you're not better than the American players, which is it's quite sad to say that, because we are quite close to the US, but you take up a roster spot if you go into the US and play, right? So you need to be better than everyone else, which puts you at a disadvantage, right? So all these changes, I think, will help. And then aside from like the obvious things, like I said originally, was just having better support, making them feel better supported. And I think just having access to people like myself, good coaches, and feeling like, hey, like, this is a good, safe environment. Like, let's be honest, there's been a lot of controversy as well, and especially in soccer, like with the things that some of these women have had to deal with and face in their professional environments. So making it a safe environment is very important as well. And I think there's been a big push with like safe sporting Canada to do that. Yeah. And you know, I'm obviously a man working in women's sports, so, and I work with male athletes as well. But since I've started working with females, and Katie, like, we used to work together many years ago, but it's something you have to be conscious of, and it's something that I feel as a man you need to even be more aware and alert, and making an effort to make sure that players feel safe and they feel respected. And I think having men in the sport make them feel all those things, right? Because if I think it's important to have that representation a little bit, and it's an important piece of it as well, because yeah, there are unfortunate stories that are out there as well that we've all heard.
I think, Joe, it's really interesting, you know, this point you're making about the support network. I mean, you're a strength and conditioning coach, and you've been working at grassroots level as well as at top level. But I was astounded. A couple of years ago, I got approached by a female footballer who was former German international. She played for Bayern Munich. She played over here in the WSL. And the point she contacted me, she was playing for one of the best known Italian teams in the world. And then a colleague, she put me on to a young woman who was playing for, again, a London-based women's soccer Super League team here, and another Dutch girl who was a top player in Italy. When they got injured, they were being sent to a physio practice down in the town or in the city. They weren't being treated in the club. And these are clubs that have got the most phenomenal setups for their male players, and probably for some of the youth academy males as well. And I was astounded by this. I mean, these are sort of top international female footballers who playing at one of the biggest clubs in the world in Italy weren't aware of or weren't being given the support that they needed just for basic injury treatment, let alone for the preparation, that the sort of stuff that you're involved with, strength and conditioning. This was only 2 years ago. It was a real eye opener for me.
It's been an eye opener for me as well. Like I think when you cross over and see this side of the game, you are a little bit astounded when they're we're talking about the biggest clubs in the world and not having resources for their female players. It's almost like, how's that possible? And I mean, we've seen that a little bit within our own federation, right? Like with the strike that the girls and the men have kind of levied against Canada Soccer, and for these inequalities, and I won't speak to them, but I'm just saying that they are present, and I think that it's changing. I think that, but we need to keep having conversations like this, and it is disappointing, but I do think that it's improving. I was on a club call the other day for one of our players, and it sounded like they're like really well supported where they're at now. This is a young player that's going into the professional game in the NWSL. And it's nice to see like multiple faces, physio, strength conditioning coaches that are in the daily training environment. So I think that, even in the last 2 years, these things are positively moving forward. So that's all we can kind of ask for. And I think that's all that the players would like as well, is just to have the resources if they're expected to go out and play at these high levels. And it's the same thing for us as we prepare for the World Cup. Like, if you're like, there's high aspirations for our team. Like, we're like one of the top teams going into the World Cup, coming off of a gold medal. There's a lot of expectation. I think Canada and the country and other people in the world are looking towards the team saying, hey, like they could potentially win. But when you're not maybe funded that way or getting that support, then it's hard to, it's just something that you would like to see for those higher level players like we're talking about.
Well, that's really interesting.
I'm not sure I'm saying all of this, but
back to you as an individual. So, strength and conditioning coach in women's soccer. What's a sort of a snapshot of a day for you?
Well, when I'm on camp right now, I'm the assistant sports scientist. So, we wake up, we have breakfast, and then players will come in for their treatment if they are getting that day. We'll kind of get things ready for the session. My role is often on the return to play side of things, and I also work with the goalkeepers. So I'll typically go out, kind of get the goalkeepers going with like an activation. And then if there's somebody that we're kind of working with or needs an individual warm up based off of where they are in their return to play process, I'll work with them. We'll transition them into the session at some point. And then after the session, depends on kind of the day of the week and where we are from the game, but often we'll have like a couple players perhaps in the gym, whether it's a couple goalkeepers or some of these return to play athletes, or maybe other athletes that are used to lifting throughout the week, work with them. And then we kind of start reviewing the day, downloading the GPS data, talking about the session. Players will come in for treatment, and then we'll follow up with the med team around whether adjustments will need to be made for those players the following day, meet with the technical staff and go through the session plans the next day. And by the end of the day, it's a long day, and you maybe talk about a couple things and get ready for the next one. So
that sounds pretty sweet to like be on the team and have that does sound like some pretty good resources that these women at the top level for Canada are getting. Like, I snowboard. Did you know, Joe? I snowboard at pretty high level, and we pretty much that would be like gold star treatment at the Olympics. Would be a day like what you're talking about. Like, it's just so great that these women are getting that feedback and those sessions, and it's not just like, let's just have a soccer session. It's like, no, they're sitting down and they're analyzing it and they're using tech. I mean, you talk about GPS tech. Do you guys use any other tech for your, like in these sessions, we talk about like Optigate and, those types of technology that's maybe recording
stuff, speed of reaction.
Yeah.
Of left foot movement, of right foot. How does that feature at the moment?
Yeah, at the moment we don't really use any other tech beyond what I've mentioned. We are talking about getting like dynamometers and things like that where we can like assess athletes in the like again who may be injured to see how they're progressing. It is quite difficult to do some of this testing, like especially like like maximal type of testing in these environments because of like the quick turnaround for games. But the discussion around bringing in other tech is always there. There's been discussions around like getting things like the Aura Ring just to monitor the athletes. But yeah, I would say there's no other like fancy tech, beyond things like timing gates just to, sorry, we don't even use timing gates actually because we have the GPS, we get their top speed from that.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, there are other tests that we've talked about doing, but we do other things like some strength endurance testing, just like, certain things around the core or the groin area. We do the best we can with limited resources because we're a traveling act, right? So
yeah, right.
Kind of how it works. We've done some jump testing in the past, but it is just a little bit difficult to make it a priority and get high quality data when you're constantly, quickly traveling from one place to the other and having, like I said, games in a short amount of time. And then we have a large group of athletes, right? There's over 20 players that we're working with to try and get them through a testing battery efficiently without kind of getting in the way of their day. Like I talked about the day, it's jam packed. So that's kind of how we go about things at the moment.
Yeah. And what are your feelings, Joe, on like tech and these teams? Like, do you think it's sometimes just get convoluted and it's just kind of like, well, they're going to run, they're going to be fast, or like, do you definitely think that's a placing in it, maybe a couple times a year just to get your benchmarks? Or
yeah, I agree with what you just said there about like doing things a couple times a year to see how players are going. The problem when you do that is that it's only a snapshot of where they are on that day. And a lot of them will do testing in their environments. Like, for example, they'll do things like groin, it's called like a groin bar where they'll squeeze their thighs together to see the force that they're outputting through their groin, or a Nordic when they're lowering themselves and get those kind of things. So they'll do those things in their club environment. I think that tech is a great tool, but it can kind of be distracting at times. And I think you need to have the resources to turn it around and do something about it. So often I do see that data gets collected, and I've done this in the past too, is you collect data and then you don't really do much with it, or it's not very actionable.
Sit on it.
Yeah, if you're going to collect it, you need to have the resources and time to look at it and do something about it. We get a lot of data from the GPS unit, right? Like how much distance they're covering, how fast they're running, and the amount of like high speed distance that they cover, the amount of accelerations and decelerations. So we just focus on that and try to do the best job we can with that data.
It's probably enough anyways.
It's a good amount, I think it's not a perfect science either, and it's always good to have a little bit more information. In our environment, I prefer to give the players specific tests that they can go and do again on their own. So like a single leg broad jump is an easy test. You just have a tape measure. You can go and do that on your own in the gym, right? Things like that, like holding like a Copenhagen side plank. If you can do it for 45 seconds, you can do that again on your own at another time point, right? So we still get the data, but the technology is just, it is a little bit cumbersome in our environment. Has a place.
Well,
right?
What's a Copenhagen side plank? I'm sure we've seen it before, but this is like fancy word for it. So
yeah, it is a fancy word. It's a good word though. You have your foot on a bench or a step or something like that, and you're holding a side plank. So you're really like
elbow, hand.
Yeah, you'd be on your elbow. You'd have
elbow, okay.
On the bench, and you'd have to create a nice straight line from that. And as soon as your like hips would start dropping, or you're having just inability to hold that straight position, you would stop. So it's
45 seconds, like gold level standard? Like if I could do it for 45 seconds, I could be a soccer player or something.
I would say it's a good standard. I wouldn't say it's like gold, but it's certainly like, hey, if you can do this, like you have strong groins, and we feel comfortable about all the training that you're doing in a soccer practice, right? So,
does that measure groin strength?
Yeah,
both feet up though, not just one leg, both feet up.
Well, yeah, I mean, you'd have one foot on the bench, and then ideally you're like squeezing the bottom leg there as well.
Oh, okay.
Both sides, you would go on your left and on your right. You can give it a try, Katie.
Well, my family sometimes, when we've been drinking a little bit, we get into these like stupid human ability things, like push-ups and who planks the longest and everything. But I think I have a new one to bring to the game.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, you might want to start them from their knee rather than their foot, but a foot would be like...
No. You don't understand. We've been drinking. It's just like, let's get into it.
At least if you've been drinking, there's a chance you'll have some ice there. So when the injuries occur, you can get the ice pack on the groin quickly, yeah.
And they do occur, trust me. We've had, that was a good party last night. I can't feel my arms. I did too many push-ups.
Joe, you made a comment also about, you talked about a Nordic. Now that's, again, do you want to explain that?
Yeah, what's that? I don't know what that one is either.
Sure. That one's easier to explain. Like you're in a kneeling position, so you're kind of on your knees, and you'd be straight from like your knees to your shoulders and head. So your hips are extended, and then someone would hold your feet down, and you would just lower yourself down to the ground. It's very hard to do. And what this tech will do is there's like force gauges around that they'll lock your ankle into, and then you'll lower yourself, and it'll calculate how much force you're producing in that movement. So, another good hamstring exercise. Those are common injuries, right? Muscular injuries for soccer players, your groin and your hamstring. So those are things that often get measured.
Like in snowboarding, just talking about these injuries here, in snowboarding, we used to say that like, everyone gets ACL injuries because their quad is too strong and it's overpowering their hamstrings. Their hamstrings are too weak. Do you guys is there some truth in that? I mean, that was, that's like 20 years ago, like knowledge. So like,
with the ACL, the ACL literature has gone around in like a bit of a circle. It's kind of like a pendulum, I should say. Is like, before it was, your hamstrings are too weak and your quads are too strong. And now it's like, well, actually you have to have very strong quads. Your hamstrings are important, but maybe we weren't giving the quads enough attention. So, I mean, you need to have strong quads and strong hamstrings, to put it simply.
Right.
Your hamstring does act in a similar function. Like it limits the anterior translation of your tibia. So like your lower shank going forward, your hamstring, because it's behind and locked in there, it does prevent that from happening. But having strong quads also help to decelerate that same motion. So you need both. Yeah.
You need both. But what we were saying is that it's more common that your quads can overpower your hamstrings. So you kind of like bring your hamstrings up to speed so that they're on par with your quads.
Well, you know what? It's true. Like I think in a lot of athletes, and including soccer players, like their quads are often more developed than their hamstrings. Like that's true. So there is truth in that. And I would imagine for a snowboarder, like I could see that being the case, that snowboarders might not be as strong in their hamstrings and their posterior chain just because of like, the kind of squatting movement and the loading of the quads that happen during that. So a lot of athletes have that challenge. So what you're saying, I think that was good advice at the time for you guys to maybe work on those on your hamstrings a bit more.
Yeah, the reason why I asked about the Nordic one is there's a bit of research recently. There's a sports scientist over here linked to a university in London who works with a lot of women's soccer teams. And he was talking about the benefit of the Nordic hamstring exercise. And it was what's termed as an eccentric hamstring strengthening exercise.
Yeah, right.
That, in his view, is where a lot of the ACL injuries were coming about, was because of a weakness in the eccentric functions of the hamstring, i.e. the ability to put the brakes on. If you're kicking a ball, your quads are extending the knee, your hamstrings have got to put the brakes on so you don't overextend. And that was quite interesting. And I saw there was my sort of nearly put my foot in it, I think, but I saw this being presented at a Football Medical Performance Association conference over here a few years ago, and it was a really good presentation. But it struck me, I was brought up by my dad, who was a physical training instructor in the Air Force, and he had us doing Nordic hamstring strengthening exercises when we were kids, so we're going back 55 years. And suddenly, 3 years ago, it's the state-of-the-art training, strength training. So I love the fact that these things come around and go around. I'm sure that people were doing that back in the ancient Olympians in Greece, and the Roman, gladiators were probably strengthening their muscles in the same way then. But now there's some research that shows why it's why it's important. I think it's a fascinating area, that one. I don't know whether you see that as well.
Yeah, that's a great story, and I think like that is the case with just the training world and fads. There's so many of them, and what's good, what's bad. There's always debates as well, but I think the tried and true things are always going to remain, and often we forget when something new comes out that, hey, probably people were doing this for a long time before, and we also find ways of making something sound new just because we gave it a new name, or like you said, there's been research there and now we might understand the mechanisms a bit better, or there's a bit more literature to suggest that this is an effective tool, and all of a sudden it gets popularized. I mean, social media, I think, helps a lot with that. And also when you see, one of your favorite athletes doing something and you're like, oh, that's what's helping them. So, but at the end of the day, I think like that's a great story about your father, and it's nice to hear that, because this is what I try to tell the young athletes I work with, right? Is just, hey, like, stop looking for something new. Just do these things consistently. I try to keep my programs quite simple. It's fun for everyone to spice them up a little bit, but oftentimes, like for young athletes when they're starting out, like just doing the basics is going to go a really long way. And that's kind of my philosophy around training, I would say.
Yeah. Getting with a strength and conditioning coach like yourself, Joe, if you're on the more serious side of training, or you have your goals that you want to get to, one of the things that I really like working with you is that you really like cut my load down. You're like, you don't need to be doing so much of that. Like, when we come in and doing 12 reps or whatever, you're like, no, we're going to do 6 of them, and we're going to do them right. And, and then you're going to rest. And I was like, no, but I want to go. Like, I should be like jumping or something after this. And you're like, no.
Yeah.
And that's really cool too. Like really understanding that volume and, quality to get your results.
Yeah. And I think like it's a common, like I would say a myth. It's a little bit of a myth, right? And we have to remember when you're training athletes that if you have that kind of opportunity to do so, you have to remember that they're already training a lot. They're already training multiple times a week and have a whole sport to prepare for. So you really want to be as effective as you can with less training. And I think that's something that Katie and I had to like talk about and grapple with a little bit, because Katie loved to work out. And for Katie, I think it was a little bit more than just, hey, I'm here for athletic performance. It was like, I just like to work out and do really, to be strong and things like that. So it was a bit of a balancing act. And I do remember like that we put on like a couple inches on your bird, like at the, tail end of all of that, of your career and stuff like that, just being a little bit, doing a little bit less, but making sure that you're recovering more. That was a big kind of like season we worked together, was like prioritizing the recovery part. And it's the same discussion point, is like doing a little bit less or being more purposeful with the work you are currently doing. I remember that. A good learning for both of us there.
Train smarter, not harder. Yeah.
Actually, funny enough, Joe was the one that introduced me to Barefoot Science. And Barefoot Science, for our audience out there, they're the ones that power this amazing podcast that Stuart and I get to be on. But yeah, Joe introduced me to Barefoot Science, or his buddy that was doing it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'd come across it through a colleague of mine. And yeah, I was working with Katie at the time and thought it might be interesting for her because, just being in the boots, like, I don't know, I'm sure that does have an effect on your foot muscles and all that stuff. So you loved them when you started using them, and here we are.
Oh yeah, I haven't stopped using them ever since. Like it's a type of thing that you get quite addicted to, that proprioceptive feeling that's like switching on your feet, like, yeah, that was been amazing. And I got to do, like, talking a little bit about tech, but Barefoot Science and all of their different associates, like yourself, Stuart, they work with like Microgate and Optigate. So I got to get on like these like crazy testing systems that tested out the shoes that I was wearing, let alone the Barefoot Science insoles, and then found out that my shoes were like totally throwing my numbers all the way off. Like they weren't helping me in the very least when I was doing testing and training and whatever. So yeah, that was pretty cool to go through.
I do remember that. That was good. It was a good experience to get that feedback. I remember when you did all that. That was good.
Yeah. Because those female soccer players I was talking about earlier, it was almost like a sort of a shaggy dog story. One of them had plantar fasciitis, one of them had shin splints, and one of them had Achilles tendon problems. And I got all of them into the Barefoot Science insoles. And the two girls who were playing in Italy had, I think, about 2 weeks from when by video assessment, I did some really simple balance tests and simple kinetic chain movement tests, which you can do over the video system. And we did the before and after Barefoot Science, and they could immediately feel and see the difference on each other and feel the difference on themselves. Then about 2 weeks before the Italian ladies FA Cup final, where they were playing Juventus, and they were really struggling, both of them, the goalkeeper and the midfield player. And he got the insoles in and had a couple of weeks of wearing them, and actually both of them played pain-free in that cup final. Unfortunately, they lost, but they both played pain-free. And then, in fact, there were four of them, and the other one was the one back in the UK who had shin splints, had missed pretty much a whole season with these shin splint problems, and had some pretty basic or non-existent treatment from some physios down the road from the club, because the club weren't helping her. And the club actually then turned around and said to her, I'm not going to name names because that would be inappropriate, but they said, if you don't get to a point where you can play 3 games before the end of the season and train in between times, your contract won't be renewed. Now, she was an international footballer. And unfortunately, time ran out, but I got her in the insoles, tested her, did a little bit of basic treatment on her just to work on the calf muscles and the shin muscles. And she played the remaining 2 games, didn't get a contract renewed, played pain-free, and then luckily for her, she got signed by one of the biggest clubs in the country once her contract was expired. But so the interesting thing for me was that the speed with which giving them that proprioceptive stimulus enabled them to get out and play pain-free. And I don't know, you've experienced this, KG, I've experienced it personally, but Joe, you obviously, do you still recommend this to some of the girls, ladies that you're coaching and training?
I don't, because I've in my role, I think it's more of something that maybe a physiotherapist would recommend, or the chiropractors that we worked with and things like that. I've kind of, not to say like staying in your lane, but yeah, just allowing them who are the experts in those areas. Over the years, I've just gone more towards the strength and power and conditioning kind of side of things. So I haven't continued like going down that path, but I think for some players it is helpful, right? Whether it's an orthotic or something like this, it's an insole to help give you that proprioception. A lot of them lack it. A simple test, going back to the balance thing, and if you have a force plate, which is great, is just having them stand on it with their eyes closed and on one leg, and seeing how they stabilize. So all of these things are incredibly important for footballers. But I can say that I've seen how like foot strengthening and just ankle complex strengthening in general can help with health. And I think that it is I think it's a very undertrained area for all athletes, their feet and their ankles and their calves. Like, it's something that gets overlooked a ton. And I think that nowadays we see a lot of like Achilles tendinopathies and other issues with soccer players that, like calf strains, like these things happen, but just because I think that we have overemphasized a little bit of like the high speed running and high intensity work, and not some of these other areas like proprioception or the low intensity jumping or skipping, the low intensity running, all these things that really train your ankles, calves, and your feet. So it's something that I tried to prescribe to a lot of athletes and have had good success with it. But the insoles can definitely help, and they're the right thing for some athletes, but assessing the foot and being able to make an informed decision about that is not something that I would say I have the skill set to do.
You recommended it to me because at the time in your professional pathway, you were like one-man band. You're like, I got to do a little bit of physio. I got to, make the programs. I got to train them. It was quite fun to be working with you at that stage in your professional career, because, now it's a part of your professionalism to stay in your lane. But back then, when you're like Wild West Joe, you have the freedom to like experiment so much with, guinea pigs like me to be like, hey, yes, look, this is a good, cool product. You should try it.
Yeah, you're precisely correct, because at that point in my career, I didn't have the networks, the people around, and I don't think you did either at that time. In with your training, where we were in Toronto, we were just trying to make it all work, and I was trying to get people.
We literally trained in Joe's parents' garage and basement.
Yeah, I had
in his backyard.
That's true. I had a garage gym. I'd built it up over a couple of years, and Katie was like the first Olympic athlete that I trained, and we were training in my garage, and that was a really great experience. And I remember, like I said, I came across anything that I would come across that I felt could help the people I worked with. I would just put it onto their radar, and that's what happened with Barefoot Science. I had a colleague, loved it. I tried it because at the time I was like, I'll try anything like that, and I did, and I still feel the same way. I was like, you know what, Katie, these are pretty cool. They might help you, like, maybe try this out. And then she kind of took it around with it. But nowadays, like with the athletes I'm working with, we have, a whole integrated support team. We have not only like physios, but chiros and mental performance people. And so it's not the same as it once was, I suppose, with
Give them a little nudge, Joe. Just introduce it to them. Tell them, because they're missing a trick. They're missing a trick. If the group aim, regardless of what your particular skill set is, if the group aim is to get the players out on the pitch, playing to the maximum of their ability with the minimum injury risk, proprioceptive stimulus is an absolute must, and the Barefoot Science insoles are the most fantastic way of introducing that. I mean, the boots thing is, sort of cleats, as you call them, is an interesting thing, because, of course, I don't know whether it's still the case, but we were told you needed the boot really almost a size, we were told always buy one a half a size too small.
I feel like all sports do that. Like they used to say the same thing about snowboard boots.
I mean, what a stupid thing to do. Let's just clamp the foot so it can't move.
I know it. You know what? There's a lot of space, I think, for people like yourself to help. Support teams like ones that I work with, and athletes who are not addressing these things, because there are a lot of athletes that I think, like, there's more than a lot. I would say, like, if we tested a whole team of athletes on their proprioceptive ability, I think you would see a lot of gaps, just like you would in other types of tests and strength tests as well. But I think proprioception is, like, again, it's an undertrained area, and I think there's been a lot of discussion as to how to best do that. But it's not a focus. It's partly, I think, because it's not really of how do I put this? It's just not a cool thing to do. You don't feel the improvements right away, I suppose. And I think that when you're talking about footwear in today's athletes, like their cleats and their shoes, like I'm just thinking about basketball because I watching the NBA playoffs right now, and I think it'd be hard pressed to change their mind about the footwear they're using. So it's how you do that, I'm not sure, but I think that there's a lot of gaps there that, and I think, going back to what we spoke about earlier, the ACL injuries, like proprioception is an important part of that too, like being good. So Katie was really good with balance though. Like we threw a lot of different things at Katie. She was an incredible athlete. Her balance was pretty, some of the best I've seen. Just,
cool.
Oh, that's cool. You got to test her out and even improve upon that. I think that says a lot about how many other athletes can improve in that area.
That's it. One of the going back to those same soccer players I was saying about, who had the Achilles tendon problems. I got her tested her balance, eyes open, eyes closed, and standing flat on the floor. She was 1 minute, eyes closed. This is, it's fantastic. Then I put her onto a slant board, and I keep it simple, going downhill, plantar flexed, 1 minute. Dorsiflex going uphill, 1 minute. Then I put her into the frontal plane challenges, so the foot inverted and everted or loaded into pronational suit. She lasted about 11 seconds. Now, she was a striker, so a lot of her movements as a centre forward were peeling off laterally, sideways. So she was looking to push off sideways, and that's where she had no control of her balance in those movements. So she was all right, she was running a straight line, but if you tried to push off sideways, she lost control of her foot. And that test on a slant board, a simple piece of kit, so revealing. But if you tested her balance flat on the floor, you'd have thought, wow, fantastic balance, no problem whatsoever.
Well, that's a good point. I'd love to chat with you a bit more about how you go about these tests. Like I remember Katie invited me to be a part of that testing battery. I couldn't for whatever reason, but I think that those simple tests, like that is a piece of tech, or if you will, but they can go a long way. And like one of my mentors in strength conditioning would always just say, and it was an intake thing that actually therapists will do for concussion screening, is to have athletes stand on one leg with their eyes closed. And he used to say to me, like, honestly, like I'd be surprised if 25% of the athletes we work with can hold that for 30 seconds on one leg with their eyes closed. So, these are simple things that can go a long way. And if you have a trained eye and know how to perhaps diagnose or pull out these gaps, because I think one of the challenges, like I like what you just said there, like I haven't heard about those different tests and putting the foot in different positions, but that's quite interesting to me because now we can be a little bit more targeted with the proprioceptive training. I think that when a lot of people, at least what I've seen sometimes, is just even with the foot stuff, like when I would go down that path, you just find yourself sometimes giving everybody a very similar protocol, and there's nothing wrong with that if it's effective protocol. But when you're working with like the higher level of athlete you work with, or even just myself as a professional, like I've grown a lot since I've met Katie and worked together with her, but like I wouldn't feel comfortable about just giving some of the things, the proprioceptive things that I would have at that time in my career. Like I would want it to be a little bit more focused, because I think that's just the standard that I would hold myself to. But it's an interesting little protocol that you mentioned that I think would be very helpful.
It's really high tech as well, Joe. What I did, I went into my garden shed, I got a bit of plywood, a half an inch thick, and cut it into a square about 14 inches square, and then I put a bit of 2x1 under one end of it, and there's my slant board.
Yeah.
And then I stand them on it and I count how many seconds. It's pretty technical.
That's the type of tech that I like as well.
But it's incredibly. I mean, we've had on our lovely podcast here, we've had a fantastic. I don't even know whether it's been broadcast yet. Former Ryder Cup golfer, whose career was shortened slightly by injury with plantar fasciitis and a few other bits and bobs. Again, these, like Katie, these professional athletes are competitive. He hated the fact that he couldn't maintain his balance in certain positions on the slant board, and we were doing that test in a flipping Costa Cafe up in South London somewhere, and there's a guy who's been at the highest level of his sport, but his balance and going through a golf swing is all about stability and control of your feet as you do the movement. Young climbers I've been working with, we had a couple of them on earlier on in the podcast season. Again, I tested 17 elite young climbers, 12 of whom in the Great Britain squad for their different age groups. Barely a single one of them had good balance through all of those different planes of movement. And again, similarly, I did the hamstring, the eccentric hamstring test on them, and about 3 of them had strong eccentric hamstrings. The rest of them didn't. And when you then translate that into their movement patterns in their sport, there were huge gains to be made by strengthening up those hamstrings in that Nordic exercise and by improving their balance. They're all wearing Barefoot Science insoles.
So I have a question for you then. Like, it sounds like you do a lot of testing on athletes, but for like let's use soccer for example. Have you found that there's like certain gaps in certain angles when you test them, or is there just a recurring theme of a deficit that you find when you're assessing footballers? Is it just how surprising that maybe they are in one area, or that they're really good at it? What have you found?
It's an interesting question. I think it's quite individual, and I've tried to see. I haven't really sort of analysed it in detail, but is it positionally related? If they're a fullback or a winger who's going lots and lots of quick movers up and down in a straight line, or if they're in midfield and they're doing lots of twisting and turning, is their balance better or their balance worse, or in different planes? I think there's elements of that, but I think it comes back to something you talked about earlier when you said about young athletes doing too much or toning back their training like you did with Katie. One of the things I felt was massively important and has lost it a little bit is kids doing a whole variety of different sports. So, play basketball, play soccer, play rugby, play hockey, go skating, go snowboarding, because then you do get that complete cross section of movement patterns and challenges that enable you to be good in them, whatever your sport or your activity is. If you've done a whole branch, gymnastics, trampolining, throw them all in. Do a bit of everything. Because if you've done a bit of trampolining and you can spin and you can control your landing, or gymnastics, then when you go on a football pitch and you're suddenly falling over and you've got to get back up again, your balance is better, your ability to land is better, your risk of injury is reduced. And I think that's the sort of thing that's hugely missing. And there have been movements that I've read where they're trying to get young people to do more varied sports game rather than specialising from the age of 6. You go to a soccer academy in a Premier League club in the UK, and that's it. You're on football. Some of the half of them ban you from doing other sports.
Yeah, but I wonder if a bit of that is like the parent being like, oh, you're like, for snowboarding, like, if my kid hasn't hit this level by the time they're 16, then it's over, So it's like they really focus on that one sport so that they're making their kid or whatever hit this benchmark by the time they're a certain age, so that like the other sports, fall behind. Whereas if we didn't have that, then parents would be more, and kids would be more comfortable with trying all these different sports to build up that base, so that when you're 18, 19, and you're old enough to decide what sport you're going into, you have that background behind you already. You were just like, I went to hockey practice for 10 years straight at 5 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah, it is difficult, I think I kind of see both sides of it, I'll be honest, because partly based on my own experience with working with these higher level young athletes now, but also part of the work that's been done out of my lab at UBC, the motor skills lab, and like talking about early specialization and the developmental pathway of elite athletes. Like for some sports, like you brought up gymnastics or soccer, like those very technical sports, if you don't have that technical foundation at a young age, even something like swimming, I see it now with some of our swimmers, like the coaches will say, they just did not focus on some of these techniques when they were 11, 12 years old, is a good example of, well, you need to have that kind of base. But, if you look at just taking the NBA example earlier that I was just saying, I've been watching the NBA, and just recently, kind of to both of your points about that later specialization, Joel Embiid, he just won the NBA MVP this year. He started playing basketball when he was 15 years old in I think it was Cameroon. and 10 years later, he's the NBA MVP, best player in the league. So I think it depends a little bit on the sport, because basketball is a later specialization sport. However, that doesn't mean that when you're 6, 7, 8 years old that you should exclusively do one sport, even if it is somewhat beneficial. Even like Katie, with you, like I know you played a bunch of sports, but wakeboarding was kind of how you was where you started, right?
Yeah, right. Right. And just to hit on the professional pathway thing, I chose snowboarding over wakeboarding because there was a pathway to the Olympics. That was like literally the reason why I chose over it. But yeah, I did a bunch of sports, and wakeboarding was the one.
Yeah, and I think I see it right now. Like I'm working with a young swimmer. He's turning 12, and the father has reached out to me to help them with their training. But the kid will play some other sports in the summer, but they kind of have identified that, hey, we want to kind of go down this swimming pathway, and swimming is a little bit of an early specialization sport. Like, I don't know if you guys follow swimming, but, you know, Summer McIntosh, she's a 16-year-old Canadian swimmer. She just broke 2 world records at the Canadian trials in April. She's 16 years old. So if you're not swimming when you're 12, 11, 10, you're not going to get to that point. So not everyone has these paths. I gave 2 different examples of an early specialization, a late specialization. But it is difficult. And I think you're right, Stuart, and we should promote young athletes to do different things. And I think from a strength conditioning perspective, like working with these athletes, I try not to give sport specific training and go even that much further. I try to say, hey, we need to balance your body and just train your body in a complementary way to what you're doing in your sport. Because, for example, soccer players, you ask them, what do you want to get better at? Like, I want to get faster. It's just the first thing they always say. And the problem is, if you just make them faster and you give them more running and you don't actually work on decelerating, then when they have to do that, that's when things go wrong, right? That's how I tore my ACL. And especially the last time when I was a little bit older, I got stronger, I got way more powerful and explosive, and then I tore my ACL again because I just had too much strength and power. I didn't really do that type of training to learn how to decelerate. But it's just the case of having balance, isn't it? And like, pardon the pun as well, but really proprioception as well. All these things need to be developed holistically, but very few people don't think like that. I think the push, like you're saying, is to, hey, you know, that person did it this way, the Tiger Woods effect, you know, they were playing golf since they were 6 years old, or whatever the Tiger Woods story is. It's quite a remarkable story. But then you also have like the Roger Federer story, where he didn't start playing tennis at a high level till later. So, you know, what to do, I don't know. But yeah, do you have any comments on that, you guys? Like,
the other aspect, you touched on this again right at the beginning, was about the volume of matches. You know, we're talking about with women's soccer, that they're an ACL, the numbers of games that are coming through now, game after game after game. Well, of course, if you're playing a sport at a professional club in an academy and you've got lots of games coming through, then doing lots of other sports outside of there. I mean, this is, you know, you talked about your ACL playing soccer. I very rarely got injured playing football, playing soccer, but I was doing ridiculous amounts of sports on top of that. So I was playing professional football as a youth, but also doing 6 hours of sport at college a week, playing basketball, you know, tennis, what you name it, I was playing it. And of course, then it was the overuse problem. And there's a big area there, which we haven't really got time to touch on, but there's always growth plate, developmental stuff as well. But yeah, it's a real difficult balancing act, isn't it? So I think there is.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, you don't live in Canada anymore, but what I would tell you both that I feel is a gap is like our physical education system. They have really changed it since we've all grown up, and it is really a shame. And I understand for the young people out there who might not be as athletically inclined, how difficult it is to succeed or go to gym class and the type of anxiety that brings on. But at the end of the day, like I think you were just talking about it, how much you played growing up. I mean, I played all kinds of different sports as well. We would play, you know, American football, we'd play basketball, we would do all these different things. And I just feel like that being kind of phased out and taken away from young people's lives right now is going to compound the problem a little bit, I would say.
There's another, you talked about PE at school. Now, we used to do leapfrog and do little games like that in the school PE physical education lesson. And again, I'm going back a few years now, but when my eldest son, who's now 30, coming up to 36, I was coaching their boys football team. We got to about age 13, 14. And I just decided to do a little test on my team, my squad of about 16 players for plyometric ability, because the club decided they wanted to buy lots of special equipment for this area called plyometrics, which is ability to spring and bounce and so on. And I said to them, you don't need to buy expensive equipment. I said, you look at my team. I've got, my smallest boy was about 4'11", on his tiptoes, and the tallest one was 6'2". As you know, and so you've got every size there. We've got footballs. We can jump over the footballs. We can go down. One boy lies flat on the floor, then another one on his hands and knees, then another one standing. We can do leapfrog. We can do hopscotch. We can do all of these old games that we did in the playground or in PE lessons at school. So I then set about, that's a little bit sort of inappropriate, but I called it plyometrics for plebs. So it was a plyometric training regime for these kids to do. And I couldn't believe how terrible they were. I just got them to do leapfrog, and they were falling. I mean, there was more risk of injury doing leapfrog than there'd been of any other activity in the world that I'd seen with these bunch of kids. They could not take off. I showed them how to do it. They couldn't figure out biomechanically, coordination-wise, how to do a simple leapfrog movement. And then I was getting them sort of going in and out of each other and doing standing height jumps and, all of these things that were so basic that they'd never done them at school. Not a single leapfrog session in a PE class. And this was, so I'm going back to about 1997, 2000, something like that. And then I did the same thing again 8 years later with my youngest son's lot. They were even worse. So there's this massive area of basic movement skills that's gone missing from the school. Now, there were some kids who would have hated that because they weren't sporty, they didn't like doing sport, whatever, and it was probably a punishment for them. But in the same token, for some of the kids who were more naturally physically capable, doing a maths test was a nightmare for them. So those things should balance out. But you're right.
But I think part of the problem with PE is that there's too much emphasis on sport and, this equals this sport, where it really needs to be getting people to love movement and to love moving and to be more, functionally, to move more functionally and fluid. Like, I think, and if we if we brought it more into that realm of, rather than just sport, I mean, you'll always have your sport people, but if you had it more into a realm of getting people to love movement, I think that would change a lot of things. But I mean, there's a lot of things about the school system that are red flags for me. So if you don't like it at the end of the day, then you can always bring PE your kids.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a good point. But I guess the fact is that a lot of kids, they don't get a good experience with doing these different little things, and just general, training, like little things like body weight stuff, like teaching them how to do those things. It doesn't have to be sport, like Katie's saying, and it could be jumping, like you're saying, Stuart. And I just want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that, athletes or young people in general need to be doing less, because I think the evidence is showing that they're not as physically active as they used to be, and we've almost kind of made them a little bit susceptible to some of these injuries. But I do think when it comes to physical training and the type of work that I would do with athletes, it's in those instances where less is more. But yeah, go out, play different sports, do these things. I feel like, if you're a high level soccer player and you're playing for an academy and you're kind of under contract, that's a bit of a different situation. But we're talking about a very small group of people in that case, right? I think most young people and young athletes out there can do well with a little bit of leapfrog or learning how to move and doing other different things, dance, you know what I mean? All of that stuff. But
And one of the things when I get lots of runners coming in to see me with injuries, and and I just say, look, when you go out and you're back running again, we get to that point. What I want you to do is run backwards, run sideways. There's a little slope along the side of the pathway or the track. Run up it and run down it. Even go wee the other way. Jump over a puddle rather than just stepping around it carefully. Jump, spin in the air, land, carry on running. Challenge your body with fun activities for all these different movements rather than just keeping going in a straight line. Because
that would make people watching running so much more entertaining. Like, oh, let's make a puddle here. They're going to jump and spin.
I get some strange looks when I'm walking my dogs, I can tell you. But the point is that if you do those things, when you then do trip over a tree root, if you're on a trail run, or trip over a curbstone if you're on the road, then you don't get injured. You've got the ability to react and control it and balance. Well, we've covered some ground today. I think we've probably got as far as we can go with this. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. We could talk all night on these things, couldn't we, Katie and I?
Oh, yeah. And I got my new drinking exercises to do, the Nordic and the Copenhagen side plank. Is that what it's called?
That's right, yeah.
Copenhagen side plank. Yeah, my new workouts to be done.
I need just one tip for you, Katie. If you're going to do the Nordic, and you're the one who's doing the exercise and somebody's holding your feet, make sure there's a cushion down on the floor in front of your face.
Yeah, that's probably a good thing to, and I think I'll opt for like a bench or something to do it on instead.
Take the cushion away when it's your brothers or your dad, but when it's you, make sure there's a cushion there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Joe, for coming on the podcast, our Born to be Barefoot podcast powered by Barefoot Science. It was lovely speaking to you. Quickly, what's the next big thing for Joe?
Yeah, I said earlier, but going to the World Cup, the Women's World Cup in Australia in a couple months, that's going to be the next big thing.
Wow. One last question, Joe. If anyone wants to get hold of you, do you still do private work as a strength and conditioning coach, or you still got time for that? And if so, where do people find you?
Yeah, I do. The best place to find me right now is on social media. Just go to @Joe Vex, JoeVex, or on Twitter, it's the same handle with an underscore. You just send me a message and I can try to help you out through that.
So everybody, our audience, when you guys are watching the Women's World Cup Soccer, you guys can know that Joe is on the field with our Canadian athletes, making sure that they're all ready to play and doing amazing. To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. Any of our new ones, don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you can hear this podcast frequently. Stuart, where are you?
I'm here in England and it's 10 o'clock at night. So I'm going to bid you good night from
Joe. Where are you?
I'm in Vancouver, BC.
Vancouver, BC. And I'm in Wanaka, New Zealand. And it's just getting up in the morning now. So wherever you may be, you guys have a good one. And we'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Born to be Barefoot podcast with myself, Kate Tsuyuki, and the wonderful Stuart Gordon. Please remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a 5-star review. We'll see you guys next week.